Hey, it's Brett. This is Brett and some books. We are finishing The Silver Chair, the fourth book in the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. We're on chapter 16. There's the illustration. A fawn and a squirrel. Can't think of better company. And this is The Healings of Harms. When Jill woke the next morning and found herself in a cave, she thought for one horrid moment that she was stuck back in the underworld. But when she noticed that she was lying on a bed of heather with a furry mantle over her and saw a cheery fire crackling, as if newly lit on a stone hearth, and, farther off, morning sunlight coming through the cave's mouth, she remembered all the happy truth. They had had a delightful supper, all crowded into that cave, and in spite of being so sleepy before it was properly over. She had a vague impression of dwarfs crowding round the fire, with frying pans rather bigger than themselves, and the hissing and delicious smell of sausages, and more and more and more sausages, and not wretched sausages, half full of bread and soybeans either, but real, meaty, spicy ones, fat and piping hot, and burst and just the tiniest bit burnt, and great mugs of frothy chocolate, and roast potatoes, and roast chestnuts, and baked apples with raisins stuck in where the cores had been, and then ices just to freshen you up after all the hot things. Jill sat up and looked around. Puddleglum and Eustace were lying not far away, both fast asleep. "Hi, you two!" shouted Jill in a loud voice. "Aren't you two ever going to get up?" "Shoo, shoo," said a sleepy voice somewhere above her. "Time to be settling down. Have a good snooze, to-do. Don't make a to-do. To-hoo!" "Why, I do believe," said Jill, glancing up at a white bundle of fluffy feathers, which was perched on top of the grandfather clock in the corner of the cave. "I do believe it's Glimfeather. True-true," whirred the owl, lifting his head out from under his wing and opening one eye. "I came up with a message for the prince about two. The squirrels brought us the good message, the good news. Message for the prince. He's gone. You're to follow too. Good day." And the head disappeared again. As there seemed no further hope of getting any information from the owl, Jill got up and began looking round for any chance of a wash and some breakfast. But almost at once a little fawn came trotting into the cave, with the sharp click-clack of his goaty hoofs on the stone floor. "Ah, you've woken up at last, daughter of Eve," he said. "Perhaps you'd better wake the son of Adam. You've got to be off in a few minutes, and two centaurs have very kindly offered to let you ride their backs down to Cair Paravel," he added in a lower voice. "Of course, you realize it a most special and unheard of honor to be allowed to ride on a centaur. I don't know that I've ever heard of anyone doing it before. It wouldn't do to keep them waiting." "Where's the prince?" was the first question of Eustace and Puddleglum as soon as they had been waked. "He's gone down to meet the king, his father, at Cair Paravel," answered the fawn, whose name was Orens. "His Majesty's ship is expected in harbour any moment. It seems that the king met Aslan. I don't know whether it was a vision or face-to-face, and therefore he had sailed far, and Aslan turned him back and told him he would find his long-lost son awaiting him when he reached Narnia." Eustace was now up, and he and Jill set about helping Orens to get the breakfast. Puddleglum was told to stay in bed. A centaur called Cloudbirth, a famous healer, or as Orens called it, a leech, was coming to see his burnt foot. "Ah," said Puddleglum, almost in a tone of contentment, "he'll want to have the leg off at the knee, I shouldn't wonder. You'll see if he doesn't." But he was quite glad to stay in bed. Breakfast was scrambled eggs and toast, and Eustace tackled it just as if he had not had a very large supper in the middle of the night. "I say, son of Adam," said the fawn, looking at him with a certain awe at Eustace's mouthful. "There's no need to hurry quite so dreadfully as that. I don't think the centaurs have quite finished their breakfasts yet." "Then they must have got up very late," said Eustace. "I bet it's after 10 o'clock." "Oh, no," said Orange. "They got up before it was light." "Then they must have waited the dickens of a time for a breakfast." "Oh, no, they didn't. They began eating the minute they woke up." "Golly," said Eustace, "do they eat a very big breakfast?" "Why, son of Adam, don't you understand? A centaur has a man's stomach and a horse stomach. Of course both want breakfast. So first of all he has porridge and pavenders and kidneys and bacons and omelette and cold ham and toast and marmalade and coffee and beer. After that he attends to the horse part of himself by grazing for an hour or so, and finishing up with a hot mash, some oats, and a bag of sugar. That's why it's such a serious thing to ask a centaur to stay for the weekend. A very serious thing indeed." At that moment there was a sound of horse hoofs tapping on rock from the mouth of the cave, and the children looked up. The two centaurs, one with a black and one with a golden beard, flowing over their magnificent bare chests, stood waiting for them, bending their heads a little so as to look into the cave. Then the children became very polite and finished their breakfast very quickly. No one thinks a centaur funny when he sees it. They are solemn, majestic people, full of ancient wisdom which they learned from the stars, not easily made either merry or angry, and their anger is terrible as a tidal wave when it comes. "Goodbye, dear Puddleglum," said Jill, going over to the Marshwiggles' bed. "I'm sorry if we called you a wet blanket." "So am I," said Eustace. "You've been the best friend in the world. And I do hope we'll meet again." "Not much chance of that, I should say," replied Puddleglum. "I don't reckon I'm very likely to see my old wigwam again either. And that prince, he's a nice chap, but do you think he's very strong? Constitution ruined with living underground, I shouldn't wonder. Looks the sort might go off any day." "Puddleglum," said Jill, "you're a regular old humbug. You sound as doleful as a funeral, and I believe you're perfectly happy. And you talk as if you were afraid of everything, when you're really as brave as a lion." "Now, speaking of funerals," began Puddleglum, but Jill, who heard the centaurs tapping with their hooves behind her, surprised him very much by flinging her arms round his thin neck and kissing his muddy-looking face, while Eustace wrung his hand. Then they both rushed away to the centaurs, and the Marshwiggle, sinking back on his bed, remarked to himself, "Well, I wouldn't have dreamt of her doing that, even though I am a good-looking chap." To ride on a centaur is, no doubt, a great honor, and except Jill and Eustace, there is probably no one alive in the world who has had it. But it is very uncomfortable, for no one who valued his life would suggest putting a saddle on a centaur, and riding bareback is no fun, especially if, like Eustace, you have never learned to ride at all. The centaurs were very polite in a grave, gracious, grown-up kind of way, and as they cantered through the Narnian woods, they spoke without turning their heads, telling the children about the properties of herbs and roots, the influences of the planets, the 9 names of Aslan with their meanings, and things of that sort. But however sore and jolted the two humans were, they would now give anything to have that journey over again, to see those glades and slopes sparkling with last night's snow, to be met by rabbits and squirrels and birds that wished you good morning, to breathe again the air of Narnia, and to hear the voices of the Narnian trees. They came down to the river, flowing bright and blue in winter sunshine, far below the last bridge, which is at the snug, red-roofed little town of Baruna, and were ferried across in a flat barge by the ferryman, or rather by the fairy Wiggle, for it is Marshwiggles who do most of the watery and fishy kinds of work in Narnia. And when they had crossed, they rowed along the south bank of the river, and presently came to Cair Paravel itself. And at the very moment of their arrival, they saw that name, bright ship, same bright ship which they had seen when they first set foot in Narnia, gliding up the river like a huge bird. All the court were once more assembled on the green between the castle and the quay to welcome King Caspian home again. Rilian, who had changed his black clothes and was now dressed in a scarlet cloak over silver mail, stood close to the water's edge, bareheaded, to receive his father, and the dwarf Trumpkin sat beside him on his little donkey chair. The children saw there would be no chance of reaching the prince through all that crowd, and anyway, they now felt rather shy. So they asked the centaurs if they might go on sitting on their backs a little longer, and thus see everything over the heads of the courtiers, and the centaurs said they might. A flourish of silver trumpets came over the water from the ship's deck, and sailors threw a rope, rats, talking rats of course, and marsh-wiggles made it fast ashore, and the ship was warped in. Musicians, hidden somewhere in the crowd, began to play solemn, triumphal music, and soon the king's galleon was alongside, and the rats ran the gangway on board her. Jill expected to see the old king come down it, but there appeared to be some hitch. A lord with a pale face came ashore, and knelt to the prince and to Trumpkin, and the three were talking with their heads close together for a few minutes, but no one could hear what they said. The music played on, but you could feel that everyone was becoming uneasy. Then 4 knights, carrying something and going very slowly, appeared on the deck. When they started to come down the gangway, you could see what they were carrying. It was the old king on a bed, very pale and still. They set him down. The prince knelt beside him and embraced him. They could see King Caspian raising his hand to bless his son, and everyone cheered, for it was a half-hearted cheer, for they all felt that something was going wrong. Then suddenly the king's head fell back upon his pillow. The musicians stopped, and there was a dead silence. The prince, kneeling by the king's bed, laid down his head upon it and wept. There were whisperings and goings to and fro. Then Jill noticed that all who wore hats, bonnets, helmets, or hoods were taking them off, Eustace included. Then she heard a rustling and flapping noise up above the castle. When she looked, she saw the great banner with the golden lion on it was being brought down to half-mast. And after that, slowly, mercilessly, with wailing strings and disconsolate blowing of horns, the music began again, this time a tune to break your heart. They both slipped off their centaurs, who took no notice of them. I wish I was at home. Eustace nodded, saying nothing, and bit his lip. I have come, said a deep voice behind them. They turned and saw the lion himself, so bright and real and strong that everything else began at once to look pale and shadowy compared with him. And in less time than it takes to breathe, Jill forgot about the dead king of Narnia, and remembered only how she had made Eustace fall over the cliff, and how she had helped to muff nearly all the signs, and about how all the snappings and quarrelings, and she wanted to say, I'm sorry, but she could not speak. Then the lion drew near them with his eyes, and bent down and touched their pale faces with his tongue, and said, Think of that no more. I will not always be scolding. You have done the work for which I sent you into Narnia. Please, Aslan, said Jill, may we go home now? Yes, I have come to bring you home, said Aslan. Then he opened his mouth and blew. But this time they had no sense of flying through the air. Instead, it seemed that they remained still, and the wild breath of Aslan blew away the ship and the dead king, and the castle and the snow and the winter sky, for all these things floated off in the air like wreaths of smoke, and suddenly they were standing in a great brightness of midsummer sunshine. on smooth turf, among mighty trees, and beside a fair, fresh stream. Then they saw that they were once again on the mountain of Aslan, high up above and beyond the end of the world in which Narnia lies. But the strange thing was that the funeral music for King Caspian still went on, though no one could tell where it came from. They were walking beside the stream, and the lion went before them, and he became so beautiful, and the music so despairing, that Jill did not know which of them it was that filled her eyes with tears. Then Aslan stopped, and the children looked into the stream, and there, on the golden gravel of the bed of the stream, lay King Caspian, dead, with the water flowing over him like liquid glass. His long white beard swayed in the water-weed, and all three stood and wept. Even the lion wept, great lion tears, each tear more precious than the earth would be if it was a single diamond. And Jill noticed that Eustace looked neither like a child crying, nor like a boy crying and wanting to hide it, but like a full grown-up crying, or at least that is the nearest she could get to it. But really, as she said, people don't seem to have any particular ages on that mountain. Son of Adam, said Aslan, go into that thicket and pluck the thorn that you will find there and bring it to me. Eustace obeyed. The thorn was a foot long and sharp as a rapier. Drive it into my paw, son of Adam, said Aslan, holding up his right forepaw and spreading out the pad toward Eustace. Must I? Said Eustace. Yes, said Aslan. Then Eustace set his teeth and drove the horn into the lion's pad, and there came out a great drop of blood, redder than all the redness that you have ever seen or imagined, and it splashed into the stream over the dead body of the king. And at that same moment the doleful music stopped, and the dead king began to be changed. His white beard turned to gray, and from gray to yellow, and got shorter and vanished altogether, and his sunken cheeks grew round and fresh, and the wrinkles were smoothed, and his eyes opened, and his eyes and lips laughed. And suddenly he leapt up and stood before them, a very young man or a boy. Jill couldn't say which, because of people having no particular ages in Aslan's country. Even in this world, of course, it is the stupidest children who are most childish, and stupidest grown-ups who are the most grown-up. And he rushed to Aslan and flung his arms as far as they could go around the huge neck, and he gave Aslan the strong kisses of a king, and Aslan gave him the wild kisses of a lion. At last Caspian turned to the others. He gave a great laugh of astonished joy. Why, Eustace, he said. Eustace, so you did reach the end of the world after all. What about my second best sword that you broke on the sea serpent? Eustace made a step toward him with both hands held out, but then drew back with a startled expression. Look here, I say, he stammered. It's all very well, but aren't you... didn't you... Oh, don't be such an ass, said Caspian. But, said Eustace, looking at Aslan, hasn't he, died? Yes, said the lion in a very quiet voice. Almost, Jill thought, as if he were laughing. He has died. Most people have, you know. Even I have. There are very few who haven't. Oh, said Caspian, I see what's bothering you. You think I'm a ghost or some nonsense. But don't you see? I would be that if I appeared in Narnia now, because I don't belong there any more. But one can't be a ghost in one's own country. I might be a ghost if I got into your world. I don't know. But I suppose it isn't yours either, now that you're here. A great hope rose in the children's hearts, but Aslan shook his shaggy head. No, my dears, he said, when you meet me here again, you will have come to stay. But not now. You must go back to your own world for a while. Sir, said Caspian, I've always wanted to have just one glimpse of their world. Is that wrong? You cannot want wrong things any more now that you have died, my son, said Aslan, and you shall see their world for 5 minutes of their time. It will take no longer for you to set things right there. Then Aslan explained to Caspian what Jill and Eustace were going back to and all about Experiment House. He seemed to know it quite as well as they did. Daughter, Aslan said to Jill, pluck a switch off that bush. And she did, and as soon as it was in her hand, it turned into a fine new riding crop. Now, sons of Adam, draw your swords, said Aslan, but use only the flat, for it is cowards and children, not warriors, against whom I send you. Are you coming with us, Aslan? Said Jill. They shall see only my back, said Aslan. He held them rapidly through the wood, led them rapidly through the wood, and before they had gone many paces, the wall of Experiment House appeared before them. Then Aslan roared so that the sun shook in the sky, and 30 feet of the wall fell down before them. They looked through the gap, down into the school shrubbery, and on to the roof of the gym, all under the same dull autumn sky which they had seen before their adventures began. Aslan turned to Jill and Eustace, and breathed upon them, and touched their foreheads with his tongue. Then he lay down amid the gap he had made in the wall, and turned his golden back to England, and his lordly face toward his own lands. At that same moment, Jill saw figures whom she knew only too well running up through the laurels toward them. Most of the gang were there, Adela Pennyfeather and Cholmondeley Major, Edith Winterblot, Spotty Sorner, Big Bannister, and the two loathsome Garrett twins. But suddenly they stopped. Their faces changed, and all the meanness, conceit, and cruelty and sneakishness almost disappeared in one single expression of terror. For they saw the wall fall down, and a lion as large as a young elephant lying in the gap, and 3 figures in glittering clothes with weapons in their hands rushing down upon them. For, with the strength of Aslan in them, Jill plied her crop on the girls, and Caspian and Eustace plied the flats of their swords on the boys, so well that in 2 minutes all the bullies were running like mad, crying out, "Murder! Fascists! Lions! It isn't fair!" And the head, who was by the way a woman, came rushing out to see what was happening. And when she saw the lion and the broken wall and Caspian and Jill and Eustace, whom she quite failed to recognize, she had hysterics and went back to the house and began ringing the police with stories about a lion escaped from a circus and escaped convicts who broke down walls and carried drawn swords. In the midst of all this fuss, Jill and Eustace slipped quietly indoors and changed out of their bright clothes into ordinary things, and Caspian went back into his own world, and the wall, at Aslan's word, was made whole again. When the police arrived and found no lion, no broken wall, and no convicts, and the head behaving like a lunatic, there was an inquiry into the whole thing, and in the inquiry all sorts of things about Experiment House came out, and about 10 people got expelled. After that, the head's friends saw that the head was no use as a head, so they got her made an inspector to interfere with other heads. And when they found she wasn't much good at even that, they got her into Parliament, where she lived happily ever after. Eustace buried his fine clothes secretly one night in the school grounds, but Jill smuggled hers home and wore them at a fancy dress ball the next holidays. And from that day forth, things changed for the better at Experiment House, and it became quite a good school, and Jill and Eustace were always friends. But far off in Narnia, King Rilian buried his father, Caspian the Navigator, 10th of that name, and mourned for him. He himself ruled Narnia well, and the land was happy in his days, though Puddleglum, whose foot was as good as new in 3 weeks, often pointed out that bright mornings brought on wet afternoons, and that you couldn't expect good things to last. The opening into the hillside was left open, and often in hot summer days the Narnians go there with ships and lanterns down to the water and sail to and fro, singing on the cool, dark underground sea, telling each other stories of the cities that lie fathoms deep below. If you ever had the luck to go to Narnia yourself, do not forget to have a look at those caves. And that's the end of the book. Start book number 5 soon. Thanks for joining me, and have a good day.